Donald Trump and others. You know, the first step in doing something bad to someone is to define them as being other than you. Once they're other, then you can build a wall, you can, deport them, you can do terrible things to them. And that happens in our bodies too. And so we talked earlier today about intimacy as being healing in terms of love and relationships and so on. But I think it's also true in not only a horizontal kind of intimacy, but a vertical intimacy. You know, anything that helps you see that, yes, on one level we're separate, but on another level we're part of something larger that connects us all, that ineffable, transcendent state, can have a direct impact on things we can measure in our bodies. In other words, if we could expand the contracted self in a chronic inflammation or an autoimmune disease so that you don't see your body as being not self, you expand it beyond that, what kinds of changes could we measure in function, in the microbiome, in gene expression, and telomeres and other things like that? So I'm just curious to know your thoughts about that.
Well, the slide, the video I showed of the mother and the baby, I mean, you can't get more intimate than that, right? The baby is part of her body, and then the baby takes in her bacteria, and then the baby is being nursed by her, and then kissed by her, and even licked by her, and all her secretions, the smells, the tastes, they're all kind of part of the intimacy. We've lost this ability to be intimate in that level, and yet that's the transmission also of the microbiome, vertical and horizontal, because once the baby is in that environment, there's father, and there's siblings, and there's exchange of microbial information, which means genetic information. So, and it's all because of the intimacy in the family, which happens with mammals. All mammals nurse their babies, they all coo, they all cuddle, they all kiss, they all touch, they form family bonds, they protect, they play, they laugh, they entertain themselves and each other. This is not considered part of healing, but it should be. It should be. The most important thing is, in Ayurveda there's a phrase, if you want to know what your experiences were like in the past, look at your body now. If you want to know what your body will be like in the future, then look at your experiences now. And experience is a very mysterious thing. It's an interpretation also. If I say I love you, and you want to hear that, then your body will make dopamine and oxytocin. But let's say somebody says I love you, and you're thinking you're going to have a divorce, then the same information will create adrenaline and cortisol. So it's not just what's coming at you, but how you interpret it. That influences what's happening in your body. So I think of inflammation one side and then homeostasis on the other side. And it affects every disease, and now we can measure these inflammatory markers.
It's true, and I think what we both do is that our body has a remarkable capacity in most cases to begin healing if we treat what's causing that disruption in the homeostasis, what's causing the problem. It's amazing how dynamic these mechanisms are, how quickly you can get better or worse depending on whether you're moving more towards homeostasis or more towards that disequilibrium, and how we can measure so many of those things.
So, when I said about states of consciousness, states of biology, the shift can be instantaneous. I'll give you an example. Somebody comes and says to you, your mother was in an accident, or the stock market, all your life savings have disappeared. Your shift in biology is instantaneous. At that moment, your body goes into the fight-flight response, inflammation, blood pressure rises, platelets get tricky. The next minute I come and tell you, I'm sorry, that was somebody else. Your body immediately shifts, okay? Immediately. There's no gradual shift from this state to another, right? So this, and I've been kind of criticized for this is a quantum shift. Quantum shift means from here to here without going in between anywhere. It's a radical shift. So here's something you can do any moment. I like people to practice this. Is as you're listening to me right now, just turn your attention to who's listening. What do you feel? Presence, right? You can shift into presence anytime. And when you shift into presence, your body is in baseline homeostatic stasis.
Yeah, just to build on that, when we started doing research 40 years ago, we showed in just 3 to 4 weeks that the heart disease could begin to reverse. The blood flow actually improved to the heart. It was pumping blood.
And Dean was the first person to show that in the world. And people kind of, in the beginning, were not accepting this idea that you could reverse heart disease.
Well, and part of the reason was that they thought, well, even if you could reverse it, it couldn't happen that quickly. We know the blockages take decades to build up, so how could there be improvement that you could actually measure in just a few weeks? And then later it was found that the arteries, the blockages in the arteries of the heart is only one of many mechanisms. There's a whole web of mechanisms that affects your heart and your blood flow. The arteries are not like lead pipes. They're lined with what's called smooth muscle that can constrict or dilate. As Deepak mentioned, the platelets can get more sticky or less sticky. Their new blood vessels can grow. We had a patient in our program at UCLA just recently who within just 5 weeks showed well, one of his blockages went from 50% to 20% blocked, someone in the LA Police Department. We had a guy on the heart transplant list who, while waiting for a donor, in 9 weeks his heart function improved so much that he doesn't need a heart transplant anymore. It's like, what's the more radical intervention here? A heart transplant or, walk, meditate, eat well, and love more. And so I just am so impressed by how, even if we don't always understand why these improvements can occur, we're getting more and more information through the pioneering studies that Deepak and others are doing, the work that my colleagues and I are doing, and now many others, to elucidate these mechanisms. But even if we don't always yet know why things can improve so quickly, we know that they do. And I think it's only a matter of time before we can fill in those gaps.
So Dean, you should know he's a cardiologist by training. How many people knew that? So he's a heart doctor. And one of the most common surgeries in the world today, the two most common procedures are coronary artery bypass graft surgery and what is called angioplasty. And that's like a $400 billion industry in hospitals. Dean, how many people's life is prolonged if they have stable angina and they get a bypass?
Well, it's interesting. There have been 8 randomized trials of, say, stents and angioplasties, and they all showed the same thing, that in stable patients, they don't work. They don't prolong life, they don't prevent heart attacks, they don't even reduce angina. And maybe 1 or 2% of people who undergo bypass surgery, who have what's called left main disease or equivalent and for left ventricular function, benefit from that. And we've been paying in this country over $100 billion a year for these procedures that are dangerous, invasive, expensive, and largely ineffective. Now, if someone's in the middle of having a heart attack, that could be life-saving, but for most people who get these procedures are not. And so when we spent 16 years to get Medicare to cover our program, and midway through it, we met with the person who was running Medicare at the time, and he said, well, we'll do a demonstration project, but you first have to get a letter from the head of the National Heart, Lung and Blood Institute of the National Institutes of Health that your program is safe. I said, safe? Like compared to having your chest cut open? He said, yeah, that it's safe for older people to walk, meditate, eat vegetables, quit smoking, and love more, as opposed to getting your chest cut open. That's sort of blowing up balloons in your arteries. I said, you must be joking, and he wasn't, and that's what we had to do. I mean, it's at that level. So, but things do change. There's an old saying that physics progresses one funeral at a time, and I think that's often true for medicine as well.
So, I think you should be aware of this fact that 1 to 2% of people may be benefited if they have stable angina without bypass. And that's what's happening every day in all the hospitals of our country, medical equipment manufacturers, the people who do the angiograms, the x-rays, the bypass. What a huge rip-off.
Well, there's a medical industrial complex, just like there's a military industrial complex, which is not to say that drugs and surgery don't have their place. They can be life-saving when used appropriately. But often with chronic diseases, as we talked about this morning, with the case of heart disease, you can often reverse it in most cases through changing diet and lifestyle, and therefore prevent it. Treating diabetes with drugs doesn't work. I mean, there have been two major studies, the Navigator study and the Accord study in the New England Journal of Medicine, showing that getting your blood sugar down with drugs didn't prevent the premature death, didn't reduce the complications of diabetes. Getting it down with lifestyle actually does. 1 out of 49 men who've got early stage prostate cancer benefit from surgery, radiation, or chemo. The other 48 often get maimed in the most personal ways. They're impotent, and so they can't have sex. They're wearing diapers because they're incontinent for no benefit, a huge economic cost. And yet, our studies have shown that the same lifestyle changes that can reverse heart disease and diabetes can slow, stop, and even reverse the progression of men with early stage prostate cancer, and by extension, in all likelihood, early stage breast cancer. And it's important when we talk about personalization, and yet we found that it wasn't like there was one set of diet and lifestyle interventions for reversing heart disease or a different one for diabetes or prostate or whatever. It's almost as though if you give your body the right raw ingredients that allow it to go back to the homeostasis that you talked about, your body has a wisdom and it can almost extract what it needs in order to begin to heal. Again, our bodies have this remarkable capacity to begin healing if we stop doing what's disturbing that homeostasis, what's causing the problem, and allow our bodies to do what they do best, which is to heal if we get out of the way of that.
So Dean, we are also looking here at herbs like ashwagandha, shatavari, all the common guggulu, etc. And there's some data that shows that they're adaptogens, that they modulate your body's response to stress. It's probably a lot of what the plant-based diet does too.
Yeah, the plant-based diet is not only what it doesn't have, cholesterol, for example, is only found in animal protein, but what it does have, there's literally hundreds of thousands of protective substances. And where do you find them? Mostly in fruits and vegetables, whole grains, legumes, soy products, things like phytochemicals, bioflavonoids, carotenoids, retinols, isoflavones, genistein, lycopene. There's at least 100 to 200,000 of these that have anti-cancer, anti-heart disease, even anti-aging properties. There's more and more evidence coming out, as we talked about earlier today, that getting it past this whole fat versus carbs debate, which I'm really tired of, is that animal protein itself significantly increases your risk of premature death from all causes, particularly heart disease and the most common forms of cancer and so on. Whereas plant-based protein is not only not harmful, it's actually protective. And so I think there's now a convergence of recommendations that we're finally, with all the bickering and controversies that people read about, one day they say this, and one day they say that, and how with them to see whatever you want, these damn doctors can't make up their minds. In fact, there is an emerging consensus that a whole foods plant-based diet is the healthiest way to eat. That's naturally low in the bad fats and naturally low in sugar.
And of course, industrial food production, you have antibiotics and hormones and
Yes.
growth factors all being pumped into these animals as well.
It's true. And to the degree you can eat organic, you're not getting most of the insecticides, which we now understand are mimic endocrine and hormones, which cause endocrine disruptions. So there's more and more evidence that this is the healthiest way to eat. And the more mechanisms we look at, and the more mechanisms that Deepak and his colleagues look at, the more scientific reasons we have to explain why these simple changes can be so powerful. We were trained, Deepak and I, and most doctors, that if it's not a drug, and if it's not something high-tech and expensive, how powerful could it be? Like, how powerful could meditation be, just sitting around with your eyes closed? And, and the kinds of studies that he's reporting on in Nature in a couple of weeks, the studies showing that meditation alone can change gene expression, and the more you meditate, the more it works. I mean, I think those kinds of things are building bridges and giving permission to people to try these things that they thought were so, woo-woo and far out, to realize that when there's a scientific basis for it, and now that there's Medicare coverage for our program, and now that Medicare is paying for it, most of the other insurance companies are, it really creates a sustainable way of giving permission to use the experience of suffering when they get diagnosed with an illness. This change is hard, but if you're hurting, suddenly it's like, well, that stuff is kind of weird, but let me try this weird stuff, because there seems to be some science that is working. And because these underlying biological mechanisms that Deepak has talked about are so dynamic, most people find that they feel so much better so quickly. It really reframes the whole reason for making these changes, from preventing something bad from happening to enhancing more joy and pleasure and love now, which is ultimately what makes them sustainable.
Dean, you started with heart disease, then you kind of extended your work in prostate cancer and diabetes. Are we looking at a future where we can basically look at other chronic illnesses, autoimmune you mentioned,
Sure.
and how we can reverse them?
Well, we are. Laura Esserman is the head of the Breast Cancer Center at UCSF. We're planning to do a study on early-stage breast cancer to see if we can reverse that through diet and lifestyle. I'm working with the Center on Aging at UCSF to do a randomized trial of people with early-stage Alzheimer's disease. There's some pilot data from Dale Bredesen and others doing work like ours showing that may have an impact. You talked about how the Alzheimer's gene is affected a few minutes ago. And one of the nice things about doing the work we're doing, we're training hospitals and clinics and physician groups around the country because Medicare and other insurance companies are paying for it. So they'll pay for 72 hours of training, and we divide that into 18 4-hour sessions, an hour of yoga and meditation. I mean, who would have thought Medicare would be paying for yoga and meditation 10 years ago? An hour of love and support, an hour of supervised exercise, and an hour of a group meal with a lecture. Now, the expensive part of doing these studies is usually the intervention. The Women's Health Initiative costs over $1 billion and didn't really even show that much. But that's now being paid for by Medicare and by most insurance companies. So we can piggyback on that, and we'll be working with Rob Knight here in San Diego to look at changes in the microbiome, as you've been doing. We're working with Elizabeth Blackburn, who we did the earlier studies showing that these simple changes in lifestyle. That's right. She won the Nobel Prize for discovering telomerase and her work with telomeres. And we did a study a few years ago showing the telomerase increased by 30% in 3 months, and over a longer period of time, the telomeres actually got longer compared to control group. So we'll be able to look at changes in telomere length before and after. We're working with Stan Hazen at the Cleveland Clinic to measure TMAO levels, one of the blood levels of a substance that may be more predictive than cholesterol for heart disease. So it's a new model for doing studies at a fraction of the cost and a fraction of the time.
So just as an aside, a story. A while ago I was at the Aspen Festival, Ideas Festival, and the brain, they have the brain conference every year. And I got a call from the head of R&D at one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world. Won't name the company. And they wanted to meet. And what they had found was that in some patients who have intractable epilepsy, if you put a vagal nerve implant, the intractable epilepsy disappears in some people. The vagus nerve is your 10th cranial nerve, goes from your brain, from your midbrain. It influences your facial expressions. It influences the tone of your voice. It influences your breathing, your heart rate variability, and ultimately it goes into the abdomen to all the organs like the liver, the spleen, and all the organs.
The anti-stress nerve.
The anti-stress nerve. And so the epilepsy got better, but then they found in a few patients, coincidentally, their other diseases got better. So if they had bronchial asthma, that got better. Or they had rheumatoid arthritis, that got better. So I was aware of this, and I said, we can do this vagal stimulation without putting an electrical implant. He said, how? I said, sun salutation. Sun salutation. You know what you do with yoga every morning.
That's pretty radical compared to putting a thing in your brain.
And or there are certain bandhas and kriyas, or even breathing techniques, pranayama. He said, I know, but how do you make money out of that? So, we are a public company and we are responsible to our shareholders. So we would like to create a map of all these nerves and then create devices to implant. Do you imagine the amount of expense, the research that will go on, and then the implants, and then the trauma that will occur? But nevertheless, what I'm saying to you is that every time you meditate, every time you do yoga asanas, even simple asanas, cat, cow, every time you consciously breathe, you are actually activating this nerve which goes to every organ in your body and influences
Every
self-regulation.
time you love somebody, it
Yeah.
does that. And,
Yes.
and you know, what Deepak is saying is, you know, I don't think of myself as a cynical person, but I guess most cynical people don't think of themselves that way either. So maybe they think of themselves as being realistic. But you know, I started a 501c3 nonprofit when I moved to San Francisco from Boston after finishing my residency there, called the Preventive Medicine Research Institute. And so we began training hospitals and clinics throughout the country. We trained over 50. We got bigger changes in lifestyle, better clinical outcomes, larger cost savings, better long-term adherence by far than anyone's ever shown. And half the sites began to close down the program. And they said, this is the best program we've ever had, but it's not reimbursable, so we can't make money at it, so we're going to close it down. That's why I spent 16 years working to get Medicare to cover our program. And that was with the support of Bill Clinton when he was president, and Newt Gingrich when he was Speaker of the House, and 20 members of the Senate, 30 members of the House, all came together in this highly polarized environment we have in Washington, D.C., because these are really human issues, and they appeal across the political spectrum. And so it's a way of bringing people together, which I think itself is healing. And now that we have the reimbursement, and now that we have the insurance coverage, it makes it much more interesting for those same interventional cardiologists who can't justify doing stents and angioplasties on stable patients the way they did before, because the studies show they don't work, and that's been a major source of income, can now find that they can practice medicine in a new way. And it's a much more compassionate approach for both the doctor and the patient. Because if you have to see a new patient every 8 minutes, you don't really have time to talk about the things that matter most. You don't have time to teach your patient how to meditate, or how to love more, or how to exercise, or find out what's going on with their stresses at home, or at work, or at school, or in the family, and in the marriage. And now we can spend 72 hours working with a whole team approach, just like Deepak has a team here at the Chopra Center. It makes all the difference in the world. And it's a much more, you know, most doctors wouldn't recommend medicine as a career for their sons or daughters because it's not fun practicing medicine this way. But now we can go back to the spiritual basis of why most people go into medicine and healthcare in the first place, which isn't to make money, it's to make a difference in the lives of people. And now we have a new model for doing that.
So, Dean has led this work. When I first moved to San Diego, we were actually affiliated with Sharp, the health system here. But the doctors basically were very resistant to our presence. They were angry. So I had to leave Sharp, and we had to start the Chopra Center because the physicians weren't supportive. But now we have UCSD Medical School, and you know this course is some of the CME credits that you're getting are coming from the medical school.
And our program is going to be at UC San Diego in a few months as well. So we've come a long way.
Things have changed. Okay, we have about 7-8 minutes for questions. If you want to come up, there's microphones. Please use this opportunity to ask Dean any question. Just go up to the microphone.
Hi, I have a question. I have been wanting to do some research on why it's so common for people who go plant-based to say after a few years, 10 or so, the doctors recommend that they go on iron. I've had a few friends that after years they've started trying to eat meat, but they hate it, and their body isn't responding. And so I was just curious on why that happens after so many years of being plant-based.
Well, for most people get too much iron, which is, you know, iron is an oxidant, and that's why if you're a guy or a postmenopausal woman, you should be taking vitamins that don't have iron in them, because most people get too much iron. And your body can't really get rid of excess iron except by bleeding, which is you know, not the best way to do that. So, on the other hand, if you're eating an improper plant-based diet, if it's strictly vegan and you're not eating a wide variety of diverse foods that are high in iron, and sometimes it's a little harder for your body to absorb iron from plant-based sources, which is again why, but if you have, say, vitamin C, your body will absorb that iron better. But if you're, you know, some people eat plant-based diets but don't do it in a healthy way, and sometimes they do become iron deficient, but it's not nearly that common.
How about just taking iron in that?
And you can just take ferrous sulfate or ferrous gluconate if you really have blood levels of iron that are deficient. It's very easy to replete that.
Thank you.
Yes.
Dr. Ornish, a friend of mine has cardiomyopathy. Okay, it's really me.
Someone you know well.
Yes.
And you're a friend of yourself.
Those three people, me, myself, and I, yes.
But you spoke mostly before about coronary artery disease, but with cardiomyopathy, with a large heart, I wonder if you found that any of your techniques cause a reversal of that disease, progressive disease as well.
Well, it depends what the source is. I mean, cardiomyopathy means your heart isn't pumping blood as well as it should. The most common cause is coronary artery disease and heart attacks, where part of your heart's muscle gets turned into scar tissue. What is yours caused by? Do you know? Is it viral?
A gift from my mother at birth, congenital.
It was congenital. Are you okay? That's not very common, but there's actually someone here named Debbie, I think I met earlier, who had a cardiomyopathy. Are you here, Debbie? Debbie, are you here? Anyway, she was telling me that she also had a congenital cardiomyopathy, and she went on the program, and her ejection fraction improved from 17% to 40%. But we have several people now, and I showed a couple of them earlier in my lecture, who have cardiomyopathies from the most common cause, which is from coronary heart disease. And they were on the heart transplant list, and while waiting for a donor, in 9 weeks they improved so much that they didn't need a heart transplant anymore. We did PET scans using measures to look at the blood flow, which improved significantly, but also radiolabeled sugar, so we could, because the cells of your heart take up sugar as a fuel, and you can label and see how many of the cells are actually functioning. And we found that a whole lot more were functioning just a year later, and the ejection fraction, the ability of the heart to pump blood, went up correspondingly. And since we don't really have a lot to offer for cardiomyopathies in general medicine, other than drugs to try to make it, easier for the heart to, make the resistance of the heart pumping against, they're not really so much improving the heart's function. I think it's especially important there.
And yoga again, the physical yoga,
Yes.
yoga asanas, there are many studies that show that the ejection fraction is improved. So take up a yoga program.
The asanas, the pranayama, but also the diet, the exercise, and the love and support. I think they all have a synergistic effect in improving that. And the nice thing is you can measure it so easily with an echocardiogram. It's not invasive, so you can be an N of 1 study and try these things. But I just found that to reverse a condition, whatever it happens to be, it takes a lot. That's why we were the first to prove that, because people didn't go far enough. So if you're just trying to stay healthy, the more you change, the more you improve. It's not all or nothing. But if you're trying to actually reverse something that's potentially life-threatening, give it 100% and then measure it and see what happens. And let me know.
I will, thank you.
Hello, doctors. Thank you so much for being here and the millions of lives that you've touched, the opportunity to ask you questions. But I was listening and thinking about when you're talking about the healing power of love and the connectedness that we all share as one. And I was wondering, as intelligent, supposedly as intelligent and as advanced as we are as human beings, why do we seem to be the only species on the planet that interrupts that? So like when you mentioned a dog, Dr. Triple, like the love that we have or connectedness that you can find, and there's no grudges, there's no other consciousness there as far as it's spreading, that as wonderful as beings we are, why are we interrupting that? What is it about us that
Well, let me just say a few words, and I'd like to hear Deepak's answer more than mine, actually. But I think that one of the things that we both say is that awareness is really the first step in healing. And when we're aware that, I studied for 40 years with an ecumenical spiritual teacher named Swami Satchidananda, and Deepak has studied with many eminent spiritual teachers. And he used to say, when you point your finger at someone, there are 3 fingers pointing back at you. And people say, "What are you, a Hindu?" He'd say, "No, I'm an Undu." And it's all about raising. When we think, I gave an anecdote this morning in our very first study. We had 2 guys. One guy was an older guy who was homophobic. One of the other guys was gay. And they started yelling at each other, and they both got chest pain. I thought they were both going to die. This is going to be the end of my very short research career. And when I help them understand that when you are angry at someone, when you hate somebody, out of that place of darkness and fear, it actually harms you more than it harms the other person. And there's all kinds of physiological data that Deepak alluded to earlier that really supports that. And so when people understand that, it really is like shining a light in the darkness. You know, the darkness, the light drives out the darkness, but it has to be a really bright light. And I think we're living in an era now where the darkness and the light are both becoming stronger. And so all of you are potentially bright, all of us are bright lights. The same Swami I told you about earlier, he said, you know what the difference between illness and wellness is? And he wrote the word illness and circled the word I, and then wrote the word wellness and circled those first two letters, we. You know, it's like when we move from that sense of being separate and only separate, yes, we're separate on one level, but on another level, we're part of something larger that connects us. And all spiritual practices ultimately take you to that place. And the reason why the things that Deepak mentioned earlier, love and compassion and altruism and kindness are so healing, is that they are shining a light in that darkness. That is what that moves us out of that sense of being separate into that sense of being, yes, we're separate on one level, but we're a part of something larger. That takes us out of you're the other, you're something different, I can do something bad to you, as opposed to saying we are all part of that, and that the most selfish thing I can do is to be loving and compassionate, because that's what's going to free me from that anger and that hatred that is eating my body up, as well as freeing you. It doesn't condone or excuse what you've done, but it frees both of us from the harmful effects of that and creates the light that enables us both to transform.
So, all that, you know, the spiritual tradition, Vedanta, etc., it's clearly understood that human beings have the capacity for self-awareness. All animals are aware, but they're also innocent. So they're part of the food chain, they don't kill unless they're hungry, etc. You know, they don't cause eco-destruction, mechanized death, drones, atom bombs, extinction of species, everything that we do. That's our diabolical part that comes with free will, and also with our creativity. So our creativity can be divine, it can be diabolical. And that's therefore creativity and self-awareness and free will are both a blessing and also a curse in a way, because we are capable of doing tremendous harm. It could be the cause of our own extinction. In the Vedanta, and maybe this is what I'll talk about tomorrow, there are 5 causes of human suffering. Animals suffer if they are treated cruelly, but they don't suffer from existential dilemmas like, who am I? Or why do I have to get old? Or I'm going to die. You know, so I don't think...
But my dog wonders if dog exists. Oh no, he exists.
Yeah. So we have these problems that come with self-awareness. And so Vedanta says there are 5 reasons for human suffering. Not knowing who you are, not knowing your true nature, grasping and clinging that which can't be grasped at or clung to, because it's all impermanent in the relative, being afraid of impermanence, identifying with a socially induced hallucination called the ego, and the fear of death. And when you look at these, they all come to the first thing, not knowing who you are. And that's why we do this spiritual practice, to find out the source of our own being. Maybe we'll talk about that more tomorrow. You've given me something to talk about. Thank you. Thank you very much.